Welcome, everybody, to another very special episode of Legends and Lectures. I'm here with the wonderful, the delightful, the very funny. If you've ever seen any of his interviews, he will deny it. I know he will deny it. The incredibly witty Dr. Marc Morris. Marc Morris, thank you so much for being here. I'm a huge fan of your book, especially Anglo-Saxon book. I think it's the best book that's ever been written about the Anglo-Saxons. I don't care what you have to say about it, because I know you're going to say, "Oh no, 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 no." But yes, I do think so. Especially the way that you've structured it is very interesting because it's all done by you. You don't do it by years, and it's not just a rattling on of what happened after this. It's not like, reading the history of the Franks where it's just like some things happen, something's good and something's bad, and then you go on to chronologically talk about all the things that have happened. Instead, you go by people, which I think is far more interesting and much more engaging. But for those who don't know you and your many books and your series, of course, your Castle series, please tell people who you are and what you do.
Oh, I don't think I can improve on anything you've just said. I think I can only sort of do myself harm. So perhaps we'll just stop it there. Um, as you said, my name's Marc Morris. I have been a self-employed medieval historian for about a quarter of a century now.
Living the
Um,
dream.
yeah, yeah, you might say. So for about yeah, so round about the turn of the millennium, I did a TV series on castles. I was doing my doctorate at the time. And that was a very useful kind of course correction because, as anyone who's done or is doing a doctorate will know, you get further and further down the rabbit hole. You end up every day thinking, what am I doing? Wasting my life on this incredibly niche aspect within an already niche field. This will lead to, you can become very fixated and obsessed, and your focus narrows. And that was very useful because it just I had very keen, enthusiastic people, mostly my age, TV producers and script editors and things in their 20s and 30s. Just in, taking me places and saying, okay, tell us about this. Why is this so exciting? And they didn't know anything about history, but they provided all these kind of enthusiastic and intelligent questions. And it was about castles. So it was very back to basics. There's a very sort of everyman aspect to castles in a way that perhaps cathedrals or abbeys or whatever are not. And that off the back of that, I got my first big book deal. And then I've written books ever since, really. My TV career, perhaps the less said, the better. But the books certainly have kind of kept the rent down for the last 20 odd years. And I did one on Edward the First, which seemed to need doing. I did one on the Norman Conquest, which you've mentioned. I did one on King John, which is my perhaps success to esteem, I think the French say, didn't particularly trouble the bestsellers charts. And then the Anglo-Saxons, which was a sort of surprise hit. And who knows why? It came out sort of in the throes of COVID, so perhaps people were sat home with nothing better to read. Um, and I've done little smaller projects along the way. So basically, I do the Middle Ages almost invariably focused on England, but latterly, I mean, the British Isles as well. And and that's it really. And little bits of touring and talking and public history. Really, whenever the phone rings or whenever I get an email, I generally say yes. Here I am.
And here you
you
are.
know,
Tell us a
you
bit about
asked,
your
here I am.
tell us a bit about your PhD.
Um, I sounded very down on it a minute ago. It was I didn't to go back even further. I didn't want I wasn't didn't think I was going to have a I wasn't burning to do history as a teenager. I wasn't. I loved doing it as a subject at school, but I wasn't sort of like, oh, I know. I mean, I think very few teenagers, even if they're really into history, can say, oh, my dream is to be a medieval historian, self-employed medieval historian. Imagine all the wealth and the cars and etc. that will come my way. So I but I was really, really like doing history as an undergraduate and as indeed a postgraduate. While I was being taught, and the surprise with the PhD, perhaps I should have done more research beforehand, was the fact that I was just left to my own devices. I was like, well, go, this is a question you've set yourself. Now go and answer it. So the teaching sort of disappears quite almost immediately, and you're not being given a weekly essay or even a monthly essay. It's just like, this is your goal, and take however many years you want to answer this question. But there's an awful lot of kind of grunt work, sort of work at the coalface. I think I spent my first 6 months kind of filling in index cards because this was in a pre-computer age. So although there's a sort of satisfaction by the end of it that you realize it's like, a 4-year version of the Karate Kid. You spend 3 years kind of waxing on and waxing off or sanding the decks. And there's a lot of monotony to that, obviously. By the time you've finished, you go, oh, I've kind of realized now what the point of that was because I've learned all these techniques along the way about reading medieval Latin, or I know the scope of the archive that the 13th century government produced, or whatever it is. But there's a certain amount of tedium that goes with it. My thesis, for what it's worth, was on the Earls of Norfolk in the 13th century, and again, it wasn't. I didn't think that was the subject I was born to study, but it was just a very big sort of subject with a lot of archive because the last one died in 1306 and all his estates were sequestered by the crown. So more private documents for that particular comital family than any other in 13th century England. But that was just something that was suggested to me, and I sort of saw it through to the end. And it's a very rare book nowadays. There's about 500 copies in existence, I think, for the completists out there.
I'll have to find it now. I didn't know that it was actually available publication.
No, it's commercially available, and I think it's fair to say it's the very last word on the 13th century Earls of Norfolk. It's not been surpassed in the past 25 years, as to my knowledge.
It's wonderful when you don't have to defend yourself.
Well,
So let's start with your friends and mine, the Anglo-Saxons. And
hmm.
we don't really like to mention the D word on this show because there were no Dark Ages. There was only the early Middle Ages. And so we'll begin with the Romans leaving England, or did they? Really, or did they? So how long after the Romans left, or quote unquote left, did the Anglo-Saxons actually come over? What did they come over to when they got here?
Gosh, there's so many questions off the back of your question. So you said, did they leave? I mean, yes, some of them left, certainly. There's a rupture between Rome and Britain in the early 5th century. And the first thing to say, I suppose, is our sources for this period are virtually written sources are virtually non-existent. So that's the big problem. As before I started this book, I knew a fair bit about late Anglo-Saxon England, but nothing about the early period, really. And I knew virtually nothing about the Roman period. So I was quite surprised to discover that because we think of the Romans as so sophisticated and so literate, as indeed they were, but no written sources survived for Britain except for the first century of Roman occupation. And that's only one or two bits. So we can only apprehend the Romans really through archaeology. And so, it's clear nonetheless that there was some big rupture at the start of the 5th century, and things have been going bad for several generations. And uh, it seems from such fragmentary sources as we have is that the rupture was, in the first instance, the people in Britain themselves saying, enough, to hell with this, we're going to do our own thing. Because why are we bothering to pay taxes or whatever when you've withdrawn the armies and you're not providing us with any defense against the people we'll come on to who have been attacking for generations. Late Roman Britain have been under attack from at least the late 3rd century by people from Northern Europe on the fringes of the empire, the Saxons as they called them, and increasingly from the north and the west as well. So from the Picts in what is now Scotland, and from the Scots in what is now Ireland.
Yes.
So they're under attack on all sides, and they decide that they would be better off, away from the empire. They weren't, but so that's kind of like so. Short answer is Roman power is withdrawn or rejected at some point around the year 400. And because they are under attack from people from the north and the west, the people in post-Roman Britain, the people running the show, decide that they ought to have mercenaries to help defend themselves, and they recruit some of the Germanic mercenaries or Germanic people who have been invading from the east and the south to fight against the people invading from other directions. Which it sounds kind of like, with the distance of, like, 1600 years, it sounds like, well, that was a stupid thing to do. But it was a thing that was being done, you can see by analogy with better documented parts of the Roman Empire. It was being done everywhere else. And if you find yourself, all of a sudden with nobody to wield the sword and nobody to do the fighting, then it would appear to make good sense. I think one thing that's often forgotten is that when the Roman Empire was working properly, civilians were not allowed to bear arms.
That's right.
The state had a monopoly of violence, and it's all very well to say, well, you should have just picked up the swords and the axes yourselves. But if you're a playwright or a mosaic layer, or a historian like me, then it's makes far more sense to say, well, we just get these hairy guys with axes and swords who seem to know what they're doing, and if we pay them enough, then they'll be on our side. So that's what happens, and it fairly quickly unravels. At some point in the 430s, 440s, certainly by the middle of the 5th century, the mercenaries have turned on their employers and just thought, well, we'll just have this for ourselves. So that's the way the story starts, and it's frustrating, as I say, as someone who cut their teeth doing 13th century stuff, where you have more information than you can possibly look at in one lifetime. You can waste 4 years, for heaven's sake, doing the 13th century Earls of Norfolk and hundreds of unpublished rolls, to go from a situation where you have too much evidence to virtually no evidence at all. It's from my point of view, a bad way to start a book. Lots of people subsequently told me how much they like that chapter, because they sense my impatience behind it as a historian in the true sense of the word, someone who wants to get to the written records. So I deal with the archaeological stuff, but with a certain amount of, but what really can we sort of say for certain about this? And the answer is not very much.
I think that's what makes it intriguing is if you already have the answers, well, somebody's just going to tell you the answer. Well, as if you're the one who's supposed to be finding this out yourself, and there is no evidence. Well,
Mm.
then you can sort of deliciate in sweet Fanny Adams and go, well, let's find out together what we know. And I
Yeah,
think that is what is quite intriguing about it. You start the
it's
Anglo-Saxon period at 400. Take that, given. How many Anglo-Saxon kingdoms or petty fiefdoms sort of spring up around this time?
well, this is the thing. It's just when I went, I live in the southeast of England, in
Mm.
Kent, near the close to the continent as you can be. And I was taught that the kings of Kent were called Hengist and Horsa, and they got off the boat in 451, because that's what it says in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which was written just 4.5 centuries after the event.
That's all.
So of course there's a legendary element that has entered those chronicles by that point. So it's striking that the founding fathers of all these kingdoms arrive either as father and son couples with alliterative names like Hengist and Horsa. And so they're kind of like Romulus and Remus, founding
Mm.
fathers of Rome. They are legendary figures. What's interesting is I was taught that, and that's what you can certainly see even in, very, very important seminal books on the Anglo-Saxons, like Stenton's Anglo-Saxon England, which was first written in the 40s, 1940s. That those chronicles were accepted as more or less true until kind of like the second half of the 20th century. And nowadays we treat them as kind of like origin stories. Um, what we would say nowadays is these kingdoms as such don't come into play until at least a century after the initial settlement. So whatever survived of post-Roman England survives. And kingdoms, we first start to get kind of really good evidence of kingdoms from the 570s, 580s. We start to see them at that point. And there are certain they start to be mentioned in continental written sources. Also, we've got coins that they were striking. I mean, not many, because they're striking really for prestige reasons, gold coins. But also the two big archaeological indicators that something more than just sort of little petty fiefdoms or whatever you call them, little tribal groupings or whatever you want to call them, that's lesser than a kingdom. The indication that we've got something more than that is really big halls start to be built. So prior to that point, you've got some degree of differentiation in the type of buildings being built, but nothing on a big scale. And then you've got all of a sudden halls that are more than 100 foot long. And also at the same time, late 6th century, you've got what the 19th century archaeologists called princely burials, still called that today. So individuals who are being interred with not just a sword or a comb or some indication of superior status, but a whole bunch of stuff, just loads and loads of treasure. The famous example that most people know is Sutton Hoo in
Hmm.
Suffolk, where someone very important, we assume a king of East Anglia, because nothing like this in terms of scale has been found anywhere else, was buried in a boat that had been deliberately brought ashore. Especially in the middle of the boat was built a burial chamber, a room which was just stuffed with bling. It's some of the greatest treasures in the British Museum, the Sutton Hoo hoard. So you see, although that's the biggest and most important that's yet been found, it wasn't unique in the sense that there are other burials of similar, not the same value, but similar style. So we have people who are styling themselves as kings, clearly. And so that's 100 to 150 years after they first appear as settlers. We've got the emergence of kingdoms. And again, the names were kind of taught to me when I was about 6 or 7, but most people will be familiar with them. Kent I've already mentioned, and you have Sussex, Wessex, and Essex, i.e. the South Saxons, the West Saxons, and the East Saxons. And further north, the Mercians, the East Anglians, and furthest north, the Northumbrians. So you have this sort of galaxy of kingdoms. The other thing to say very quickly is I've just kind of sold you a bill of goods in as much as suggesting there were only 7 of them. Again, that's what you will be taught at school. That's what my children were still taught at school.
Yeah, the
And that's certainly
heptarchy. Yeah.
the heptarchy, yeah, which is part of the national curriculum here in still in the UK. But that again makes it sound like it was some great plan from the off, like a sort of Game of Thrones style 7 kingdoms. And what we can actually see when we look at such scanty evidence as we had even in the 7th century is there were way more than 7 initially. There were dozens of kingdoms. And so probably at some point along the time scale, there were precisely 7. They start to thin out as the centuries progress. But to begin with, who knows? 20 kingdoms, 30 kingdoms, 100 kingdoms. But these kingdoms start to coalesce is the point. When we start to see them, they're in a process of coalescing, and the bigger ones, the preeminent ones, are already making themselves known and throwing their weight around.
Some of the maps from this time are really great. Well, they're maps that were kind of fixed after the fact. One of my favorites is there's a map. If you look at Wales at this time, asking, oh, well, what were the Welsh kingdoms? There's just a big sort of picture of Reged, but it always has a question mark after it. So it's like Reged over here, maybe.
I I was doing there's one of the maps in my book was kind of there's a map comparing the sort of the provinces, I think they're called provinces, of late Roman Britain, because Roman Britain itself was subdivided into 4 or 5 provinces. And I spoke to several people, the best people I could find, to say, what is the actual evidence for the boundaries between these provinces? And the answer is kind of like, it's not based on just pure guesswork, but it's pretty close. We can identify the provincial capitals like London, Lincoln, Cirencester, etc. But as to where those boundaries lie, but once someone draws a map and they've got a whole bunch of letters after their name, then it very quickly becomes accepted fact.
Mhm.
And it's like, you go, well, I didn't think we had any written evidence, never mind cartographical evidence. So where did this map come from? And the answer is, oh, people then start to kind of say, oh, I'm sorry, I don't have time to reply to your emails because you're asking these tedious but fairly fundamental questions like, what is the basis of this pretended knowledge?
Speaking of pretended knowledge, so you
Yes.
had mentioned the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle or Chronicles several
Hmm.
times. So how accurate for this period, how accurate is the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle?
Well, it depends. I mean, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle kicks off in the late ninth century. It's a creation of the court of King Alfred the Great. So pretty good on the 880s and the 890s, and even probably the 850s and 860s. Like all sources, the further you go back, the further it is being written from events, the more dubious you have to be about this, what it's telling you. It's possible. It's more than possible. It's certain in some instances that it was based on earlier sets of annals. But I don't think I referred to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle at all until I can't remember. I think I used it for the ninth century stuff, and I may have kind of used it on the sly without just referring to it in the footnotes for the eighth century stuff. But it's yeah. So it's like all the sources in the book. You judge each source on its merits, who wrote it, how close they were to events, how well informed they were. If it's uh, Bishop Asser writing about Alfred, well, he knew the man. So he's likely to tell you some true stuff. He'll probably try and feed you a whole bunch of untrue stuff to make
Hmm.
Alfred big and important. But at least he's in the room. He's very much in the room. So, whereas if it's someone saying, um, to go over the same old ground, or in this particular year, Hengist and Horsa arrived and they fought a battle with the Saxons. It's like, well, okay, so you say. So you were told.
What about other Saxon heroes? Somebody wanted to ask about Hereward the Wake and Wayland the Smith. Are they completely fictional?
I don't know anything about Wayland the Smith. I think Wayland the Smith doesn't crop up in the book, so that's Wayland Smithy. He's a character of pure legend, I think. Whereas Hereward the Wake is outside of my jurisdiction really. He's into the Norman Conquest period, so Hereward the Wake is some local landowner at the time of the Norman Conquest who resists the Normans. And the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle continues after the conquest for nearly 100 years, down to the 1150s. So he is mentioned in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, and what credible stuff we know about him relates to his um, dealings with the Normans. I think in the it's 3 or 4 years after the conquest. So he's basically someone who doesn't take the conquest lying down, and incites local resistance in the area of sort of what we call the Fens, sort of Ely, East Anglia, and in collaboration with invading Scandinavians. But what makes him sort of appealing is I'm just trying to get this right now. About 100 years later, I think that's when the source is. There is a life he's written about in a book called the Liber Eliensis, and it's full of cracking stuff. And it's lots of good descriptions of him resisting the Normans, and he becomes a sort of folk hero Robin Hood figure in that telling. So he is able to sort of infiltrate the Norman camp in disguise. So you can see all these kind of tropes that you see in the later stories of Robin Hood. This must have been good to sort of hear this tale of this outlaw around the fire. But at the same time, how much credibility can you invest in those stories? Well, there are rather too many stories where he kind of consults with a witch or fights a dragon or whatever. I think that kind of compromises the credibility of the whole. So, as I say, with a lot of these topics, no, not a lot, some of these topics, the ones that are often uh, are sort of most wedged in the popular imagination, you have to say, oh, yeah, well, that's a great story. What we actually know about it that was written at the time is two sentences. Um, that's not to say it's not valid to say what were the kind of stories that people like listening to in the 12th and 13th centuries. What can they tell you about the 11th century is zibbity doodah.
It's like Jeff and him making up stuff about Arthur. Just think, okay.
Yeah, or I mean, another example that pertains to my period in particular is Scandinavian sagas. I
Mm.
mean, for not just Northern English history, but also Scottish history. There's a Because you have no written evidence whatsoever, particularly for sort of Scotland in the Middle Ages. it's very tempting to say, oh, well, we've got these Scandinavian sagas talking about what's going on in the 11th century. It's like, yeah, but they're written in the 13th century.
Yeah.
And when you can, I mean, the stuff that is particularly relevant to the Norman conquest is the Scandinavians, of course, invade in 1066, before just ahead of the Normans. And we have two big battles in the north, the more famous one being Stamford Bridge. And, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles got a few lines on the Battle of Stamford Bridge, whereas the King Harold's saga has like pages and pages, chapters and chapters about what the Vikings did. And you think, oh, this is great. Where you can check it out against what little we know from the contemporary record, you go, oh, well, that guy wasn't there. That guy didn't die. He survived. And this, so it's almost every point you can test the 13th century material, it's wrong. So like, why would you trust it on the deployment of troops or anything when it can't even get the protagonists right? So
And
yeah,
also,
it
you
is.
have conflicting things. So, for example, if you take the story of Brian Borova or Brian Boru, if you look at
Mm,
the saga sources, they have completely different ideas about who he was and who won. And then when you look at the Irish sources, you think, this is very heavy laden with Christian tropes. I wonder if this actually happened at all.
yeah.
It's just what
Well,
it
it's
is.
the trick with a lot of this stuff about being a medievalist, particularly being an early medievalist, which is to say I'm only an early medievalist come lately. The trick is often to sort of catch these people when they're telling the truth, catch them out. Because most of the time, if not all of the time, they have a bill of goods to sell, a bridge to sell you, and
Mhm. Yeah, people forget. We'll talk a little bit about some of the myths of the Norman conquest in a second. But people forget that people have biases and they're writing things for reasons. And sometimes many of the things that they write are not necessarily true, or they're written with a heavy hand, like somebody like Gildas, who makes certain people look very bad on purpose. That's
mm.
what he's doing. So yeah, many people take these sort of chronicles at face value and don't really look into them.
The things that often amuse me most and I have most fun with as a writer is they're not always as clever as they think they are, these writers, or at least they're, from the point of view of modern readers or modern audiences. So often the case. So you have an example like William of Poitiers, who is the biographer of William the Conqueror, will always be anxious to tell you, just how fearsome William the Conqueror was, and when William the Conqueror first took up his lance and his sword and donned his helmet, all of Francia trembled at his coming, and you think, well, he was 15, and they're sort of, that sometimes that's very obvious. One of the ones I always trot out is chapter 3 of the Anglo-Saxons book. I lent very heavily on the life of Wilfrid, who was Bishop of Northumbria in the um, late 7th century, and not just a man who bestrode his age. He was also Bishop of Sussex, and he wanted to be Archbishop of Canterbury, and he sort of ended up at various courts and going to Rome 3 times, and he really was a great person to sort of follow in his footsteps around this very complicated political world of the multiple kingdoms of southern Britain. Um, but his biographer is just so absolutely hopelessly clearly trying to defend this man's reputation from his many, many detractors. And he just has a chapter where he just sort of says Wilfrid wasn't an alcoholic. He just sort of says he never drank more than half a glass of wine at dinner. Anyone who says otherwise is a liar. Many witnesses, and you all as a modern reader, you go, I didn't even ask about his drinking. Since you've written 2 pages on it, you seem very keen to deny it. And maybe Wilfrid was absolutely abstemious, but the fact that when authors suddenly go off on one to sort of give their version of what they insist is the absolute truth, you kind of, as a modern reader, you go, well, isn't that interesting that as a psychiatrist, almost like, interesting you raised that. Interesting you mentioned your mother in this context. Let's probe a little deeper there. So sometimes they are fun in what they think what they're trying to tell you and what you intuit from it.
Since we had mentioned the Vikings, let's talk about them coming over. So the Vikings were the Anglo-Saxon redux when they came over in 793. Why did they choose Lindisfarne? Is it just because it was so far out and it had tremendous booty, or did they sort of pick it at haphazard and went, "Ooh, this is easy pickings because there's no militia here."
I think both those things. I thought you were actually going to say because it's such a cult center,
Oh,
because there is an argument that the Vikings were sort of you know were sort of attacking these sites because they in recent years have been on the other end of the on the receiving end of violence from Franks. I think I probably that's an argument which I think has you know people will kind of go either way. There's not a great deal of evidence to recommend the latter. I think I may have mentioned that idea in a sentence in the book, but certainly your first 2 points are entirely valid because they were very, very wealthy. The monasteries, they'd been acquiring vast amounts of wealth since their foundation in the 7th century. And because for all the sort of inter-kingdom violence between Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that persists well into into that period, um, the Anglo-Saxons were sufficiently down the road to Christianity that they didn't attack, or very seldom would attack, Christian sites. So the monks were, for the most part, spared the violence that was endemic in the rest of society until the Vikings come along and they say, well, you know, we don't believe in these gods. So, and it just must have been astonishing to them that kind of like, oh, you prefer to live on an offshore island with all your gold and silver and stuff. And that none of you guys have weapons or even know how to use them. So yeah, they're just really, really rich and easy pickings. The other things they go for in the early years are the sort of permanent markets that have sprung up in the 8th century, 7th and 8th centuries. So the wicks, so places like Lundenwic, Hamwic, Ipswich, are again they're just largely populated by artisans and traders. So very easy targets for raiders armed with axes and swords.
and so it's interesting though that they didn't really settle at all. Unlike the Anglo-Saxons, where they came and they settled, they didn't really settle at all until I think the 870s. Why did it take them so long? Were they really just only interested in raiding and leaving, or when they did
Well,
they
I
go,
think
ah,
they're interested in wealth. I mean, to pick you up on a point. I mean, the Anglo-Saxons have been raiding for hundreds of years prior to the
mm,
point they settled. It's just that the Roman state was there to deter them, so they couldn't settle because there
mm.
was a Roman army. It's only after Roman power has collapsed that they're able to say, they must be going back to Germany or southern Scandinavia in the 5th century, saying there's nobody there anymore. I mean, and there's we could intrude ourselves into this. We could go over there and live like kings because the Romans have gone home. So with the Vikings, what it suggests is in the first instance is they're not driven by land; they're driven by easy pickings. You just go over there, find a monastic island, take all the gold, go home, seize slaves. No one's going to stop you. Um, so it's not until 7 or 8 decades into the Viking period that they start to settle. Um, Again, this is where I may discuss these things in a sentence or two in the book, but because there is no hard evidence you might say, well, why did they start to settle? I don't know, because they wanted land, I guess. There's really no more clever answer than that. There may be any number of theories about why their homelands were no longer desirable. They're running out of land. There's dynastic competition between royal dynasties. Once it gets into that, I feel impatient, and I feel that my readers will feel impatient. So I maybe address this in a sentence. But the undeniable fact is, and from the point of view of the development of England, which is what my book is about, is they were settling in large numbers from 865.
Mm. So, but that's not the end of the story between between the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings. One of the Great War, or the clash between the Saxons and Vikings, the Battle of Brunanburh in 937,
Mm.
with my boy Athelstan, King of England, and the against Olaf, I think is a lot of I've seen a lot of people paint this war as sort of like a Christians against the pagans kind of thing. But really it was four people who had decided, well, I don't want the Vikings to take this giant piece of Northumbria again. And so they decided to band together, Ethelstan and with Constantine, King of Alba, and Owain, who King of Strathclyde, who never shows up again in any records after this battle, which I always think was kind of funny.
Yeah.
Where he fights and then he just goes, "All right, bye," and then we never hear about
Yeah.
him again.
I'm straight. You remember this much better than I do. It's 5 years since I finished writing the book, but yeah, I mean, from the point of view of Athelstan, this is the culmination of his reign. So, for those that don't know, Athelstan was the grandson of Alfred the Great. Alfred the Great, who we've only touched upon in passing. Alfred the Great was the king who reversed the tide of Viking advance. So the Vikings are raiding from the end of the 8th century. Um, they go from being pests, um, raiders to settlers, or they go from being pests to being an existential threat in the middle decades of the 9th century. They eliminate the other kingdoms of Anglo-Saxon England. So, Northumbria falls, East Anglia falls, Mercia falls in the 870s, and Wessex itself falls in 878. But Wessex survives because of Alfred. And anyone who's read Bernard Cornwell's stuff or seen the TV series, The Last Kingdom, would know all this anyway. So Wessex survives, and from Wessex grows what later referred to as England. In the first instance, um, they're styling themselves kings of the Anglo-Saxons from this point. They're sort of saying, well, we're kings of the Angles and we're kings of the Saxons. And not only is that tide sort of stopped by Alfred, it's reversed by his successors. And Athelstan being the most famous of them, he is the king who annexes Northumbria. So by the time you get to Athelstan's reign, something like England has formed. It's a very shaky construct. It's really kind of three kingdoms sort of gaffer taped together. They've got no kind of institutional coherence. It's just a kind of an overlordship, really. But it is something recognizably the shape of what is later called England. And Athelstan is clearly supremely powerful. I mean, leaving aside the kind of how much is that down to him and his irrecoverable personality, he was clearly a very successful warrior. But he's one of those kind of. I think the state that is becoming England is kind of like success breeds success. They're able to take territory from people and force them into submission and force them to pay tribute, so they become very rich, etc., etc. And it's taken to almost this absurd level by Athelstan, so that he is browbeating not just the people who've settled in sort of eastern and northern England, or what later becomes eastern and northern England, i.e., the Vikings, but as you say, he's going up to Scotland and browbeating the King of Scots and saying, you must trot down to southern England every time I summon a great council. And he's doing the same with the people in Strathclyde. These are a long way away, at least in sort of, European terms, 300, 400 miles, to sort of come if when the King of the Anglo-Saxons snaps his fingers and says, everybody, So these people on the very periphery of Athelstan's power kick up against him in 937. That's the best way I can explain it, is they've had enough of kind of being part of this Athelstan fan club, and they react against. And he does beat them in battle, and there's a big poem written about it. So it's a good way to end a chapter. And it's also a good way to end a chapter because Athelstan dies 2 years later, having done nothing in the meantime. So, that's the kind of the end of Athelstan's story. The thing I don't know if you were angling for this, is the thing that's frustrating, infuriating even about Brunanburh is we don't know where it was.
Yes, we have no idea.
We have there's very much a sort of two schools of thought. There are some people that think it's thought at a place called Bromborough, which is near Liverpool, for the pretty good reason that the first time when Bromborough appears in 12th century sources, it's spelt Brunanburh. But there is another very vocal bunch of people who support a different locations. So until we sort of dig up a whole bunch of early or mid 10th century warriors somewhere on the Wirral Peninsula. It has to remain unsettled.
This kind of does happen, right? Where exactly was the Battle of Hastings? Where was the Battle of Baden Hill?
Well, in some cases we can be fairly certain. I mean, I'm not a battlefield archaeologist, but I get drawn into these things. Like the Battle of Hastings is fairly straightforward because the sources are the contemporary sources are very adamant that it was fought at Battle near Hastings and that William the Conqueror built an abbey there. So that's one of the kind of things that doesn't need resolving as far as I'm concerned. There's also you do occasionally find really good battlefield archaeology. There's the Battle of Towton, which is way outside my period. It's very late medieval, Wars of the Roses. I mean, I'm getting this wrong. The Battle of Bosworth Field, which is practically the end of the Middle Ages, where Richard III buys the farm. He that for when I was taken round a tour of Bosworth Field when I was a teenager, it was all the land was owned by English heritage, and we sort of walked around in the rain and dutifully made notes on our clipboards, etc. And 20 years later, it's like, oh, it wasn't in that field at all. It was about 3 miles to the west. But they have actually proved it now with archaeology. And the example I was thinking of was the Battle of Lewes, which was fought between Henry III and Simon de Montfort down in Sussex in 1264. They put a new road through Lewes in the early 19th century, and they found 3 pits, I think, with approximately 500 bodies in each. So they found 1,500 dead bodies. You don't drag 1,500 dead bodies any further than is necessary to bury them. So presumably those pits were somewhere near the center of the battle. So occasionally, you do find really good evidence, but most of the time you have to say somewhere within a 3 mile radius of this spot.
You do the best you can.
Yeah.
But between all this and right before the Normans show up, we have King Canute and the Danish conquest of 1016. So what can you tell us very briefly about that? Because we talked about England getting more power and then the Vikings getting more power, and then it swings back the other way with King Canute.
Yeah, Canute as well. So after England is really forged in the 10th century, it is once again sort of rich, prosperous, united. England really does emerge in the 10th century. It's not there's no sort of epic history of it. It's the problem. The epic histories are written about Alfred heroically turning the tide, and to a lesser extent Athelstan. But what goes on in the 940s, 950s, 960s? The kings that achieve this are kind of nondescript. Their archbishops are much better documented, which is why I pivot to talking about St Dunstan at that point. What's going on there is England is being forged. So I mean, just obvious examples are prior to that point, there haven't been any shires. So when you come as an international tourist to England today, you're going to go, oh, there's Leicestershire, Oxfordshire, Derbyshire, Worcestershire, etc. None of those Midland places were called shires until the 940s or 950s. And all of a sudden, those shires appear. So this is, a country being created, someone's plan being imposed as those parcels of land are divided up. So it's strong, rich, prosperous, united, etc., which again draws foreign raiders and invaders because it is so wealthy and attractive. And that's what's going on from the 980s again onwards. Again, initially just speculative raiders. And then by the time you get to the end of the reign of, or the middle of the reign of Ethelred the Unready, say the early 11th century, Scandinavian kings of Denmark turning up with a view to conquer, and that's pulled off by Canute in 1016. So, and when he's very young at the time, he's barely out of his teens. A very successful king, very good Canute. So he reigns for nearly 20 years. He reigns from 1016 to 1035, and what he's good at is, I think, securing good PR, good press. If you look up Canute in almost any book right up to the present, people will say, oh, he's incredibly successful, such a great king of England, much better than Ethelred the Unready. And when you look at the record of his reign in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, I mean, I'm tempted to pull it off the shelf, but I can't be bothered to get up. But I probably will spend 5 minutes trying to find it as well. But if you look at the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, even in very, very sort of what am I trying to say? Sort of sparsely spread out modern print. It's 2 pages. It's about 20 lines, and there are years of his life where we have no record of what he's doing. So if there was any bad stuff being written about Canute, people weren't bothering to write it down. And you have to kind of really sort of read between the lines to say, well, he can't have been that popular because, or he must have been really violent because of this. But he managed very quickly to get the church on board. So churchmen were kind of giving him basically favorable write-ups because, as St. Paul said, the powers that be are invested by God. So they kind of said, well, he may be a Viking, he may have 2 wives on the go, but he is kind of the king. So, so he went to Rome, of course, on pilgrimage at some point during his reign. So Canute gets a good write-up. I doubt that everybody at the time in England thought he was as great as posterity seems to have done down to the present, because he's just on the eve of his reign. He lots of aristocratic families, lots of aristocratic hostages are given to Canute's father on the eve of Canute's reign. Have I got that right? No, they're given to Canute himself. Sorry, they give Canute to Canute himself before he becomes king. And when the Anglo-Saxons, or rather, the powers that be in England, swing behind Ethelred the Unready and give him one last go, Canute reacts by mutilating these hostages. So he's cutting off noses and eyes, poking out eyes and cutting off ears of aristocratic hostages. So there must have been plenty of people around in Canute's reign, plenty of powerful people who said, oh, well, I'm okay, but my brother, lives at home now because he was blinded by Canute. Or the reason I don't have any ears is because of Canute, So as I say, there are little things like that which make me think probably Canute wasn't as popular as we've been led to believe. But there's much more to be said about Canute. I've fixated on his levels of popularity, but he seems to have been a strong king, seems to have held it together for 19 years, left a right royal mess for his successors to sort out on account of the aforementioned 2 women at once problem.
That's his
Or
real.
rather, three sons by 2 different women.
That's his real
Recipe
pop. That's
for
his real PR.
disaster.
His real popular legacy. 2 in at once. Good job, buddy.
Yeah.
Now we move on. We have very little time left, but I wanted to just very quickly mention the Norman Conquest, because,
Mm.
as you well know, recently there has been some kerfuffle about whether or not the march at the Battle of Hastings actually happened. And you did write a piece on it, which we did feature in our other program. And I'd like to just iron out some of the ideas there. So it's 1066, Three Kings, Three Battles. What are the mythologized aspects of what happened at 1066? Because obviously, if you look at the biotapestry or embroidery, however you want to call it, there's Halley's Comet is there. There's 94 penises on it, which I think is very interesting that they've decided to include these things in the biotapestry. But what are the mythologized ideas about it and what actually happened?
Oh well, I mean, we've only got 8 minutes left. I mean, it's the single most famous event in English history. Okay, there's a reason that the famous sort of joke history book in the 1930s was called 1066 and all that. It's kind of where, for most people, they think English history starts. So there's enormous amounts of mythologization going on, from the moment it happens onwards. You mentioned the 94 penises on the Bayeux tapestry as a sort of clickbait. I feel I have to rise to it. 88 of them are 88 of them are horses.
Yes.
And I keep reading everywhere that this shows, how the very number of penises shows how sort of like when how biased the creators of the tapestry were against women. It's a military it's showing a military event. It's point one. But the point two is, as I keep trying to remind people all the time, 88 of them belong to horses, but there are more than 200 horses on the tapestry. So if you can conclude anything, it's that it's actually there are more mares on the tapestry than there are stallions. So you can sort of not kick that myth into touch straight away. But to go back, I mean, to the thing you mentioned to begin with is what you might call, I suppose, a Victorian myth. Is that it's nothing? It's a prelude to the Battle of Hastings. So in what happens in 1066, very briefly, is Edward the Confessor dies. The succession is unclear. The most powerful man in Anglo-Saxon England is Harold Godwinson, Edward's brother-in-law, who seizes the throne, is nominated to the throne. The sources are very propagandist at this point. Of course, the pro-Godwin ones say, "Oh, he was nominated." The pro-Norman ones say he seized the throne. Harold becomes king, and then his claim is contested later in the year by two different people. Harald Hardrada, king of Norway, who invades first, and William the Conqueror, who invades second, and of course emerges triumphant. So it's very hard for the Anglo-Saxon king, Harold Godwinson, because he's sort of facing an invasion on two fronts. Doesn't seem to realize that to begin with, because the Scandinavian invasion, the Norwegian invasion, comes crashing out of left field. He has all his troops arrayed for the whole summer of 1066 on the south coast of England. And it's not until he's dispersed them in early September that he is told within days, you won't believe this, but the Vikings have invaded, the Norwegians have invaded. So he has to rush up north. And to his enormous credit, he surprises them and beats them in battle at a place called Stamford Bridge. The question that has kind of emerged in recent days recent weeks, is how Harold got to and from the north. And for, I suppose one thing to say is the sources are unclear. The sources do not say he jumped in a boat and sailed up to Yorkshire, nor do they say he jumped on his horse and galloped up to Yorkshire. They say he went. So we have that problem again of the sources not telling us as much as we might like. That's and then the flip side of that is how he came back south again in after the Battle of Stamford Bridge. So I think you can kind of pay your money and take your choice in terms of how you think it was done. I simply pointed out that the evidence was non-existent either way, and you have to sort of therefore proceed crab-like and sort of say, well, how did other kings normally do this? How might you have done this? In the circumstances of 1066. So I said I don't have much more to add than the stuff I put in my blog post, which was just basically saying, hang on a minute,
Yes.
because for about 24 hours or 48 hours, the world's media was saying, history books will have to be rewritten. And as someone who'd written one of those history books, I was saying, will they though? So we shall see.
And there's also, obviously the thing of Harold getting the arrow in the eye. Did he really get the arrow in the eye?
Yeah. Again, there's pages in my book on that. I mean, that's the thing that's very much sort of a biotapestry related thing. It looks very much on the biotapestry like he got an arrow in the eye.
Yeah.
Having said that, the biotapestry has been mucked around with in the 18th and 19th centuries by restorers. So there's an argument to say, is that really an arrow, or did the original artist intend an arrow, or was that just someone being creative in the 19th century? The other question, which I think is more clinching, is even if the tapestry shows Harold with an arrow in the eye, can we be certain that's what actually happened on the battlefield? Because, and this is my favorite argument, hasn't really received a great deal of attention since it was first put forward in the 1980s, but the tapestry is an artistic source that borrows from other artistic sources. You can show at least a dozen occasions on the tapestry where the tapestry artist has said, right, we need a scene of people having dinner. Find me a picture of people having dinner. And someone says, here's a picture of the Last Supper. They go, brilliant. Okay. So they copy the Last Supper and they sort of change the faces. And they go, that's Odo having dinner with his retainers. So that happens a lot. You can point to very precise borrowings. And what seems to have happened in the case of Harold's death is they're borrowing from a bit of the sort of apocrypha of the Bible, which is the death of King Zedekiah and his sons at the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. I don't need to rehearse that story for you and your listeners, I'm sure, but I have no idea what the story's about. But Nebuchadnezzar was the overlord. Zedekiah was the rebellious vassal. Zedekiah was punished by being blinded. And so this is the fact that the tapestry artist seems to be copying pictures of the death of King Zedekiah, or rather the blinding of King Zedekiah and the death of his sons. Uh, there were enough bits of incidental art history material for me to kind of go, I'm convinced by that. If you look at the pictures side by side, it's like this artist just happens to be copying this particular biblical story or pseudo-biblical story.
Yeah, and we also have to
Um,
remember that even if there's a biography written about a specific king, that doesn't always mean that those things happen. So, for example, we have like, William and his possibly exploding corpse in one source. They never mention it at all, and then in a later source, they claim that William's corpse exploded when he went to die. So
yeah,
the things
I
that they
think
make up are fun.
I mean, I'd go with William exploding. It seems to be the kind of I can't think of anyone who contradicts that. Whereas with, as you say, with certain things, you have to kind of sort of weigh everything in as an even balance as possible. But with Harry, I mean, the thing that you have to sort of like, sort of remind your readers all the time is, whilst a lot of this is up for grabs, there are certain things which aren't, you know. And the one thing that we're all still satisfied about, at least here in the UK, is that Harold definitely died at Hastings, and William definitely won, So you can at least kind of like steer your book to a conclusion with those kind of certainties, and not say, well, this is all fairy tales, this is all up for grabs. These people really lived; they really did do these things, And we historians love to argue about the detail until the cows come home.
That's what
But
makes good books.
yeah, and you have to flag up the uncertainties and the gaps in our knowledge, even when you are because then you're able to lean harder on the bits which you can say this definitely happened, this is definitely true. Whereas if you're sort of going to just lard your text with unnecessary adjectives or not distinguish between speculation and myth and fact, then it will strike your readers as like, well, this was persuasive, but it might, at the end of the day, it might just be a fairy story. So one of the things I endeavor to do all the time is to kind of absolutely, underline and ring fence and say, this is absolutely the case. This is as close to the truth as we can as be without building a time machine. Whereas these other bits are later myths or uncertainties or what have you. So I think that's the historian's main job, is really to sift what's known from what is, just merely myth. To sift fact from myth, if you like.
If we had another hour, I would sit here and ask me about the Victorians, Mark. So, but the Anglo-Saxons, I think, is a great place to start for your work. I mean, as I say, you have books on castles, the Norman Conquest, King John. Can you tell us before you leave, is there anything that you're working on right now that you can tell us about?
Oh yeah, well, it's not a big secret. It's just taking more years of my life than I'd anticipated. So the Anglo-Saxons was a far bigger chunk of history than I'd essayed in the past. It's 6, 7 centuries, and so my publishers more than me, kind of, I think, said, well, the broad canvas is clearly your forte. So I'm doing a history of England, or the people who lived in England after 1066, and the adventures they had going north and west into Wales, Scotland, and Ireland, conquering, colonizing, and coming into conflict with the people who lived in those regions. And it's a really sort of, I was going to say, understudied. It's been studied enormously, studied a huge amount in the last 30 or 40 years. Um, but it hasn't really had that academic research has had very little impact on popular understanding, and even to the extent that the book has no title because there is no off-the-shelf title that's been made. Most titles or most historical tags are invented in the modern period in the 19th century. So when you talk about even the Norman Conquest, that's fairly, I think, 18th century. Harrying of the North, 19th
Hmm.
century. 100 Years' War is invented in the 1880s. But they've had time to bed in, 140 years later. Whereas any way you might conceptualize this Anglicization or English invasion or Anglo-Norman invasion of these outer parts of Britain and Ireland um, is going to have to be a newly coined term. So there's no, as I say, there's no obvious title, but whatever it is, I'm about halfway through now. So hoping to finish it next year. Should be out 2028. Yeah.
Well, if I'm still alive, I'd love to have you back for it.
No, definitely. Well, I'll be emailing you when the PR tour for that kicks off.
Oh, absolutely. And if you want to talk about any of your other books, we would love to have you back at any time because there's really
Right.
so much to talk about. And thank you so much for giving us so much of your time. We really
No,
appreciate it.
it's been a pleasure.